I'm still shaking as I write this, and it's been 3 weeks since it happened. I keep replaying that day over and over in my head, and I swear I can still feel my heart pounding like it did when everything went down. We were on our way back from visiting my ex-wife in Phoenix, me and my 9-year-old son, Jake. The whole trip had been a disaster from the start. The AC in my old Honda was barely working. It was pushing 110 degrees outside, and Jake had been complaining about everything for the past 4 hours. I was already stressed about work, behind on bills, and dealing with the usual custody drama. When Jake started whining again about being hungry and wanting to stop at McDonald's for the 3rd time, I completely lost it. I snapped at him harder than I should have, told him we weren't stopping until we got home, and the car went dead silent, except for the sound of hot air barely trickling through the vents. I could see him in the rearview mirror with tears in his eyes, and I felt like the worst dad in the world. The guilt was eating me alive, but I was too stubborn and exhausted to apologize right then. About 20 minutes later, I saw this rest area sign and figured we both needed a break before I said something else I'd regret. The place looked pretty run down, just a small brick building with bathrooms, a few picnic tables, and hardly any shade. There were maybe 2 other cars there, and it had that abandoned feeling you get at those old highway stops. I pulled into a parking spot near the building and turned off the engine. The heat hit us like a wall the second we stepped out. Jake was still giving me the silent treatment, but I could tell he really needed to use the bathroom. I grabbed my wallet and keys, and as we walked toward the building, I tried to break the tension by asking if he wanted a snack from the vending machines. He just shrugged and mumbled something about needing to pee really bad. I waited outside the men's room door for a few seconds, then decided to walk back to the car to get my phone charger. I remember thinking this was my chance to cool down and figure out how to make things right with him. The whole area felt so quiet and empty, just the sound of cars rushing by on the highway and this weird humming from the old vending machines. I was digging through my glove compartment looking for the charger when I heard the car door slam behind me. I figured Jake was done and ready to get back on the road. I didn't even look up, just said something like, "Feel better, buddy," and started the engine. The AC kicked in and I was already backing out of the parking spot when I glanced in the rearview mirror to make sure he had his seatbelt on. That's when my blood went cold. The person sitting in my back seat wasn't Jake. It was this guy, maybe in his 30s, wearing a dirty baseball cap pulled low over his face. He had this weird smell about him, like cigarettes and something else I couldn't place. My first thought was that I was losing my mind, like the heat and stress had finally gotten to me. But then he looked up and made eye contact with me in the mirror, and I knew this was really happening. His eyes were this pale blue color, and he had this expression that I can't even describe. Not threatening exactly, but definitely not normal. I slammed on the brakes so hard that we both lurched forward. My hands were shaking as I tried to process what was going on. Where was Jake? Who was this person? How did he get in my car? Before I could say anything, I heard this loud honking behind me. Some guy in a pickup truck was flashing his lights and gesturing wildly for me to pull over. I thought maybe I'd cut him off or something, but then he rolled down his window and started yelling. I couldn't make out exactly what he was saying over the sound of traffic, but I caught the words, "Not your kid," and "bathroom." That's when it hit me. Jake was still in the bathroom, and somehow this stranger had gotten into my car thinking. I don't even know what he was thinking. The guy in my back seat hadn't said a word this whole time, just sat there staring at me with those creepy eyes. The pickup truck driver kept honking and pointing toward the rest area building. I could see him mouthing "your son" and gesturing frantically. My heart was beating so fast I thought I might pass out. I had no idea what to do. Should I confront this guy? Should I drive to the police station? What if he had a weapon? All I could think about was getting back to Jake and making sure he was safe. The whole thing probably lasted less than 2 minutes, but it felt like hours. The heat, the confusion, the fear, it was all hitting me at once. I pulled over to the side of the road and put the car in park. My hands were so sweaty I could barely grip the steering wheel. I turned around to face this guy and managed to stammer out, "Who are you? What are you doing in my car?" He just looked at me for a second, then without saying a word, he opened the door and bolted. Just like that, he was gone, running across the road and disappearing into this patch of woods on the other side. I sat there for maybe 10 seconds, completely stunned, before the pickup truck pulled up next to me. The driver was this older guy, probably in his 50s, wearing a work shirt with some company logo on it. He looked as shaken up as I felt. He rolled down his window and said, "Man, I saw that whole thing happen. That guy just walked up to your car and got in like he owned it. Your little boy is still over there by the bathrooms." I thanked him about 100 times and asked if he saw where the guy went. He pointed toward the woods and said he'd never seen anything like it in his life. I was so grateful this stranger had been paying attention and cared enough to follow me. Without him, I don't know what would have happened. I might have driven off with that creep in my car and left Jake stranded at that rest stop. I did a U-turn and raced back to the rest area, my heart still pounding out of my chest. Sure enough, there was Jake standing by the building, looking confused and a little scared. When he saw me pull up, he ran over to the car with this expression I'll never forget. Part relief, part confusion. He opened the passenger door and said, "Dad, where did you go? I came out and you were gone." I pulled him into the biggest hug of his life. I was shaking so bad I could barely hold on to him. I tried to explain what happened, but how do you tell a 9-year-old that some random stranger got into your car? I kept it simple and just said there was a misunderstanding and that I thought he was already in the car. Jake kept asking why I left him, and I could hear the hurt in his voice. The guilt was crushing me. Not only had I snapped at him earlier, but I'd almost driven away and left him stranded because I was too distracted to actually look and see who was getting in my car. I kept apologizing over and over. The pickup truck driver had followed us back, and he came over to make sure everything was okay. He said he was going to call the police and report what he saw. I gave him my number in case they needed to talk to me. After the pickup truck driver left, Jake and I sat in the car with the AC running, neither of us saying much. I kept checking the rearview mirror and looking toward those woods where the guy had disappeared. Part of me was terrified he might come back. Jake was unusually quiet, which wasn't like him at all. He kept fiddling with his seatbelt and looking at me with these big eyes. Finally, he asked, "Dad, are you okay? You look really scared." That's when it hit me. In all my years of being his father, he'd never seen me genuinely afraid before. I was always the one who was supposed to protect him, to have all the answers, to be strong when things got scary. But sitting there in that parking lot, I was just as vulnerable and confused as he was. I told him honestly that yes, I was scared, and that sometimes grown-ups get scared too. I explained that a stranger had gotten into our car by mistake, and that's why I seemed so shaken up. Jake nodded and said, "That's really weird, Dad. Why would someone do that?" I didn't have an answer for him because I still don't understand it myself. The whole thing was so random and bizarre. Was the guy confused? Was he having some kind of mental episode? Was it something more sinister? I'll never know. What happened next is something I'll remember for the rest of my life. Jake reached over and took my hand, something he hadn't done in probably 2 years because he was getting to that age where holding hands with Dad wasn't cool anymore. He said, "It's okay, Dad. We're both safe now." This kid who I'd been snapping at all day, who I'd almost accidentally abandoned at a rest stop, was comforting me. We sat there holding hands for a few minutes, and I felt this overwhelming wave of love and gratitude. All the stress from the trip, all the arguing, all the tension between us just melted away. I realized that in that moment of genuine fear, we'd connected in a way we hadn't in months. I wasn't just his father trying to maintain control and authority. I was a human being who had been scared and needed comfort, and he was mature enough to give it to me. I apologized again for leaving him at the rest stop, and he said, "Dad, you didn't know. You thought I was in the car." The fact that he understood and forgave me so easily made me want to cry. I promised him we'd stop at the next McDonald's and get whatever he wanted. He smiled for the first time all day and said, "Can we get ice cream too?" Of course we could get ice cream. We ended up staying at that rest area for another 20 minutes, just talking. Jake told me about a weird dream he'd had the night before, and I shared a funny story from when I was his age. It was the kind of conversation we used to have all the time before life got so complicated with the divorce and work stress. I kept glancing at those woods, half expecting to see that strange man emerge, but everything stayed quiet. A few more cars pulled in and out, normal families stopping for bathroom breaks and snacks. It all seemed so ordinary now, like the whole incident had been some kind of fever dream. But I knew it was real because I could still smell that weird odor the guy had brought into my car. That mix of cigarettes and something else I couldn't identify. Jake asked if we could walk around and stretch our legs before getting back on the road. Normally I would have said no because I was anxious to get home, but something about almost losing him made me want to say yes to everything he asked for. We walked over to the picnic tables and he found a cool rock that he wanted to add to his collection. We talked about school starting soon and whether he wanted to try soccer this year. Just normal dad and son stuff, but it felt precious in a way it hadn't before. The rest of the drive home was completely different from the first part of our trip. Jake chattered away about his visit with his mom, showed me his Pokemon cards, and even asked if we could play some music instead of listening to talk radio. I kept checking the rearview mirror out of habit, but now it was just to see my son sitting safely in the back seat where he belonged. We stopped at McDonald's like I promised, and then got ice cream at a place Jake had been wanting to try for months. By the time we pulled into our driveway, it felt like we'd reconnected in a way that might not have happened otherwise. That night, Jake actually hugged me goodnight without me having to ask, something he'd been too cool for lately. As I was getting ready for bed, I called the police station to follow up on the report. The officer said they'd had a few other calls about a man acting strangely in that area over the past few weeks, but they hadn't been able to locate him. He thanked me for the information and said they'd increase patrols around that rest stop. I never heard anything more about it. To this day, I have no idea who that man was, what he wanted, or why he got into my car. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, but then I remember that pickup truck driver who saw it all happen. It was real, it was terrifying, and somehow it ended up being exactly what Jake and I needed. I'm writing this because I need to get it out of my head somehow, and maybe someone here has experienced something similar. This happened about 6 weeks ago, and I still can't drive at night without my hands shaking. My girlfriend Sarah and I were coming back from her sister's wedding in Portland. It was around 11 p.m., and the rain was coming down so hard I could barely see the road even with the wipers on full blast. We'd been driving for about 3 hours, and I was getting that tired, unfocused feeling you get on long night drives. I had grabbed a burger from a drive-thru about an hour earlier, but hadn't had a chance to finish it because the weather was so bad I needed both hands on the wheel. Sarah had fallen asleep in the passenger seat with her head against the window. I decided to pull over at this little rest area, not one of those big official ones, just a small gravel lot with a couple of picnic tables under some trees. The rain was so loud on the roof of the car it sounded like we were inside a drum. I figured I'd quickly eat my food and maybe rest my eyes for a few minutes before we pushed through the last hour home. The whole area was completely dark except for one flickering streetlight that barely illuminated anything. I had just unwrapped my burger when I saw this figure walking toward our car through the rain. At first I thought it might be someone having car trouble, but as they got closer, I could see it was a woman, maybe in her 40s, completely soaked and walking in this weird, unsteady way. Her hair was plastered to her head and her clothes looked like she'd been outside for hours. She came right up to my window and started knocking. Not gentle taps, but this urgent, almost frantic knocking that woke Sarah up immediately. The woman was saying something, but I couldn't hear her over the rain, so I cracked the window just enough to listen. She was asking for a ride, saying she'd been stranded and needed to get to town. Her voice had this desperate quality to it, but there was something else too, something that made the hair on my arm stand up. Sarah grabbed my arm and gave me this look that clearly said, "Don't do it." But the woman looked so pathetic standing there in the pouring rain. She kept saying, "Please, I just need to get home. My car broke down miles back." I'm usually pretty cautious about picking up strangers, but something about the situation, maybe it was the rain, maybe it was because she was a woman and seemed harmless, made me feel like I should help. Against my better judgment and Sarah's obvious disapproval, I unlocked the back door and told her to get in. The second she climbed into the back seat, the whole atmosphere in the car changed. She brought this smell with her, not just wet clothes, but something sour and unpleasant that I couldn't identify. She was dripping all over my seats, but that wasn't what bothered me. It was the way she just sat there, completely silent, staring straight ahead. I tried to make conversation, asked her where she needed to go, how long she'd been stranded out there. Basic stuff you'd ask someone you just picked up. Nothing. She didn't even acknowledge that I was talking to her. Sarah turned around to look at her and I could see the concern on her face growing. The woman's eyes were this pale, washed-out blue, and she had these dark circles underneath like she hadn't slept in days. Her hair was stringy and wet, hanging in clumps around her face. What really got to me was her hands. They were clenched into fists on her lap, and her knuckles were scraped up like she'd been in a fight or had fallen on concrete. She was wearing this old denim jacket that looked like it had seen better days, and underneath it was a stained white t-shirt. The whole time we sat there in the parking lot, she never once looked at either of us directly. I started the engine and pulled back onto the highway, thinking maybe she'd warm up once we got moving. The rain was still coming down in sheets, and I had to concentrate hard on the road. Sarah kept glancing back at our passenger, and I could tell she was getting more uncomfortable by the minute. She reached over and squeezed my hand, something she only did when she was really nervous. I tried asking the woman again where exactly she needed to go, explaining that we were heading toward the city and could drop her off anywhere along the way. Still nothing. It was like she couldn't hear me, or maybe didn't want to hear me. The silence in the car was getting really awkward. You know that feeling when someone's presence just feels wrong, like they're taking up more space than they should be. That's what it was like having her back there. Sarah whispered to me, "Something's not right about her," but I just shrugged it off. I figured she was probably in shock from being stranded in the rain, maybe hypothermic or just scared. I've heard that trauma can make people act strange, but about 10 minutes into the drive, I started noticing her in the rearview mirror. She was moving slightly back and forth, like she was rocking herself, and her lips were moving like she was talking to someone, but no sound was coming out. That's when things went from weird to absolutely terrifying. I was adjusting my rearview mirror to get a better look at what she was doing when suddenly I felt these hands wrap around my throat from behind. She had reached over the seat and was choking me with both hands, squeezing so hard I couldn't breathe. My first instinct was to slam on the brakes, but we were going about 60 on a wet highway with cars behind us. I tried to pry her fingers off my neck with one hand while keeping the other on the steering wheel, but she was surprisingly strong, way stronger than she looked. I could hear Sarah screaming, "What are you doing? Let go of him." The car started swerving because I couldn't focus on driving while being strangled. I managed to gasp out, "Get her off me," to Sarah, and that's when my girlfriend became a complete badass. She unbuckled her seatbelt, turned around, and started clawing at this woman's face and arms, trying to get her to release me. The woman was making these awful grunting sounds, like an animal, and her grip on my throat got even tighter. I could feel myself starting to black out. The edges of my vision were getting dark, and I knew I had maybe seconds before I'd lose consciousness completely. Sarah was scratching and hitting her, yelling, "Let go of him, you crazy bitch!" I managed to get the car over to the shoulder of the highway, and the second we stopped, I grabbed the woman's wrists and twisted as hard as I could. She finally let go, and I gasped for air, my throat burning like fire. But she wasn't done. She started trying to grab at Sarah, reaching over the seat and making these horrible shrieking sounds. Not like screaming, but like the sound a wounded animal makes. Sarah had managed to scratch her face pretty good. There were 3 long red marks down her left cheek that were bleeding. I opened my door and got out in the pouring rain, then yanked open the back door. The woman looked at me with these wild, completely insane eyes. I grabbed her by the arm and literally dragged her out of the car. She was fighting me the whole time, trying to scratch my face and kick me. When I finally got her out and away from the car, she fell to her knees on the wet pavement. The rain was soaking all of us within seconds. I was breathing hard. My throat felt like I'd swallowed razor blades, and Sarah was crying and shaking in the passenger seat. The woman looked up at me from the ground, and for a split second, she seemed almost normal again, almost human. Then she started begging. "Please don't leave me here," she said, and her voice was completely different, softer, more desperate. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you. I just need to get home. Please, I have nowhere else to go." For a moment, I almost felt bad for her. She looked so pathetic kneeling there in the rain, blood running down her face from where Sarah had scratched her. But then I remembered the feeling of her hands around my throat, how close I'd come to passing out while driving on the highway. I told her she needed to stay away from us, that we were calling the police. That's when she completely snapped again. She got to her feet and started screaming at the top of her lungs. Not words, just this horrible, animalistic howling that made my skin crawl. It was the kind of sound you might hear from someone who'd been locked away in a mental institution for years. She started hitting herself in the head with her fists, over and over, while screaming. Cars were driving by and slowing down to look, but nobody stopped. I don't blame them. If I'd seen this scene from the outside, I probably would have kept driving too. Sarah was yelling from inside the car for me to get back in. The woman kept alternating between begging and screaming. One second she'd be on her knees pleading for us to take her with us. The next she'd be standing up shrieking like a banshee. I got back in the car and locked all the doors. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. The woman came up to Sarah's window and started pounding on it with both fists, leaving bloody handprints on the glass. Her face was pressed against the window and she was saying something, but between the rain and her hysterical state, I couldn't make out the words. Sarah was crying and trying to dial 911 on her phone. I put the car in drive and slowly pulled away from the shoulder. The woman followed us for a few steps, still screaming, then just stood there in the middle of the road watching us leave. I kept checking the rearview mirror until she disappeared into the darkness behind us. Even after we couldn't see her anymore, I could swear I could still hear that awful screaming carried on the wind. Sarah finally got through to 911 and gave them our location and a description of what happened. The dispatcher said they'd send a unit to check the area. We drove the rest of the way home in complete silence except for the sound of the rain and the occasional sob from Sarah. I kept reaching up to touch my throat. It was already starting to bruise and hurt to swallow. When we finally pulled into our driveway, we just sat in the car for a few minutes, neither of us wanting to talk about what had just happened. The next few days were rough. I had finger-shaped bruises around my neck that took over a week to fade completely. Sarah had scratches on her arms from fighting with that woman, and she kept having nightmares about it. We both jumped every time the phone rang, half expecting it to be the police with more questions. They did call us back 2 days later to let us know they'd found the woman walking along the same stretch of highway where we'd left her. Apparently, she'd been reported missing from a nearby psychiatric facility 3 days earlier. The officer explained that she'd been off her medication and was having what they called a psychotic episode. They thanked us for calling it in and said she was back in treatment. Hearing that explanation should have made me feel better, but somehow it didn't. I kept thinking about how strong she was, how her whole demeanor changed from pathetic to violent in seconds. The officer mentioned that she didn't remember anything about attacking us. The medication thing had wiped out her short-term memory of the whole incident. That bothered me more than it should have. For us, it was this traumatic, life-changing experience. But for her, it was just a blank space. Sarah started insisting we take different routes when we had to drive at night, avoiding that stretch of highway completely. I didn't argue with her. Even now, weeks later, I find myself checking the back seat before I get in my car, something I never did before. The weirdest part is how random the whole thing was. If I hadn't stopped to eat my burger, if the rain hadn't been so heavy, if I'd listened to Sarah's instincts and not let her in the car, any one of those things could have changed everything. I keep replaying the moment when I unlocked that door, wondering what I was thinking. Sarah says I was just trying to be a good person, but I'm not sure that's enough of an excuse anymore. The experience has definitely changed how I look at helping strangers. I hate that it's made me more suspicious and less trusting, but I can't shake the memory of those hands around my throat. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd passed out while driving, if Sarah hadn't fought back as hard as she did, if there hadn't been other cars on the road to potentially help us. The what-ifs are probably the worst part. I've told this story to a few close friends, and most of them say we were lucky, that it could have been so much worse. They're right, but it doesn't make the memory any easier to deal with. I still have trouble sleeping some nights, and I know Sarah does too. It's crazy how one random act of kindness can turn into something that haunts you for months afterward. I've been meaning to write this down for weeks now, but every time I sit down to type it out, my hands start shaking. What happened to me on that back road in rural Kentucky still doesn't feel real, even though I know it was. I was coming back from a job interview in Nashville, a 14-hour drive back to Ohio that I'd decided to do in one shot because I couldn't afford a hotel. It was one of those stupid decisions you make when you're broke and desperate. By the time I hit the Kentucky border, I'd already been driving for about 10 hours and was running on nothing but gas station coffee and sheer stubbornness. It was around 2 a.m. when I decided to take what looked like a shortcut on my GPS, some back road that would supposedly cut 40 minutes off my trip. The road was narrow, winding through dense woods with no streetlights and barely any shoulder. I hadn't seen another car in probably an hour. My eyes were burning from staring at the road, and I was doing that thing where you blink hard and shake your head to stay awake. The radio had turned to static miles back, so it was just me, the sound of my old pickup truck's engine, and the darkness pressing in on all sides. I kept telling myself I just had to make it another few hours and I'd be home. That's when I saw the orange construction drums up ahead, reflecting in my headlights. At first I felt relieved. Finally, some sign of civilization, maybe some road work that would mean people were around. But as I got closer, something felt off about the whole setup. The drums were placed across both lanes, completely blocking the road, but there were no construction signs, no warning lights, no equipment anywhere. It looked hastily put together, like someone had just dumped them there. I slammed on my brakes and came to a stop about 20 feet away from them. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There was something dark stretched across the road just behind the drums, almost invisible in the shadows. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, and that's when I saw it clearly. It was a spike strip, The kind police use to stop fleeing cars, hidden right behind those orange drums. Anyone who tried to move the drums and drive through would have driven right over it and shredded their tires. My brain was trying to process what I was seeing. This wasn't road construction. This was a trap. Someone had deliberately set this up to stop cars in the middle of nowhere. I sat there for maybe 30 seconds, engine still running, trying to figure out what to do. That's when I heard it. A voice calling from the woods on my right side. "Help! Please, somebody help me!" It sounded like a woman, and she seemed to be in real distress. My first instinct was to get out and see what was wrong, but something about the timing felt too convenient. I just discovered what was obviously a trap, and now suddenly there was someone in the woods crying for help. I kept my engine running and rolled down my window just enough to hear better. The voice came again, closer this time. "Please, I'm hurt. I need help." I grabbed my phone and used the flashlight to scan the tree line. That's when I saw her, or at least I saw a figure crouched behind a tree about 30 feet into the woods. It looked like a woman in light-colored clothing, but something about the way she was positioned seemed off. She was too still, too perfectly positioned where someone from the road could just barely see her. If she was really hurt and desperate for help, wouldn't she come closer to the road? Wouldn't she wave or move around? Instead, she just stayed there in that exact spot, calling out every few seconds. My exhausted brain was trying to make sense of it all. The spike strip, the barricade, and now this woman in the woods. It all felt like pieces of the same puzzle. I put my truck in reverse and started backing up slowly, keeping my headlights pointed toward the woods so I could see what was happening. That's when everything went to hell. As I was backing up, I saw movement in my peripheral vision, not just from where the woman was hiding, but from multiple spots along both sides of the road. Dark shapes were emerging from the trees, and they were all moving toward my truck. I counted at least 4 or 5 figures, maybe more. They weren't running, but they were walking with purpose, like they knew I couldn't go anywhere because of the roadblock behind me. Some of them looked like they were carrying something, tools or weapons, I couldn't tell which in the darkness. The woman's voice had stopped calling for help, and now I could hear other voices, men's voices, calling out to each other, not shouting, but communicating in low tones like they were coordinating something. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode. I realized I was completely trapped, or at least, they thought I was trapped. There was no way I could turn around on this narrow road, and going forward would mean driving over the spike strip and destroying my tires. But these people had made one mistake in their little setup. My truck was an old Ford F-150 with decent ground clearance, and there was a narrow dirt shoulder on the left side of the road. It was probably meant for farm equipment or emergency vehicles, but it looked just wide enough for me to squeeze through if I was careful. The figures were getting closer, and I could make out more details now. They were all wearing dark clothing, and at least 2 of them definitely had something in their hands that looked like weapons. I didn't have time to think it through. I cranked the wheel hard to the left and gunned it, aiming for that narrow strip of dirt beside the road. My truck lurched as the tires hit the uneven ground, and for a terrifying second, I thought I was going to get stuck or flip over. The engine roared as I pushed the gas pedal to the floor, and I could hear rocks and dirt spraying up underneath the truck. My headlights were bouncing wildly as I bounced over ruts and holes, but I could see I was past the spike strip now. One of the figures had run toward my truck and was close enough that I got a clear look at him in my headlights. A guy in his 30s wearing a dark hoodie, holding what looked like a crowbar or tire iron. His face had this cold, calculated expression that scared me more than if he'd looked angry or crazy. This wasn't some random crime of opportunity. These people knew exactly what they were doing. I managed to get back onto the pavement on the other side of their roadblock, my tires squealing as they grabbed the asphalt again. I didn't slow down. I kept the pedal floored and put as much distance as possible between me and whatever the hell that was. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the steering wheel steady. I kept checking my rearview mirror, expecting to see headlights following me, but the road behind me stayed dark. For the next 20 minutes, I drove like a man possessed. Every shadow on the road looked like another obstacle. Every curve made me think I was about to run into another trap. I was going way too fast for those winding back roads, but I couldn't make myself slow down. Finally, I saw lights ahead, a gas station that was still open, glowing like a beacon in the darkness. I pulled in and sat in my truck for a few minutes, engine running, just trying to process what had happened. My shirt was soaked with sweat and my heart was still racing. I called 911 and tried to explain what I'd encountered, but I realized how insane it sounded. A roadblock with a spike strip, People hiding in the woods? The dispatcher was polite, but I could tell she was skeptical. She said she'd send a unit to check the area, but given how remote that road was, I knew it would be hours before anyone got there. By then, those people would be long gone. I stayed at that gas station for another hour, drinking coffee and trying to calm down. The clerk, a kid who couldn't have been more than 20, asked if I was okay because I looked pretty messed up. I didn't know how to explain it to him. How do you tell someone you just escaped what was obviously a planned ambush by people who make their living robbing or worse to stranded motorists? The drive home took another 4 hours, and I didn't take any more shortcuts. I stuck to the main highways where there was traffic and lights and other people around. Every time I saw brake lights ahead of me, or any kind of slowdown, my pulse would spike and I'd start looking for alternate routes. I kept thinking about how well organized that whole setup was. The spike strip perfectly positioned behind the barricade, the woman positioned just right to lure someone out of their car, the other people spread out through the woods to surround whoever stopped. This wasn't their first time doing this. They had it down to a science. What really bothered me was thinking about all the people who might not have been as lucky as I was. Someone driving a car instead of a truck. Someone who couldn't have made it around that roadblock on the shoulder. Someone who got out to help the woman in the woods before realizing it was a trap. I started imagining scenarios where families with kids might have stopped, or elderly people, or someone who wasn't paranoid enough to question why there was no construction equipment around those barricades. The thought made me sick to my stomach. I called the police again when I got home and gave them a more detailed report, including the exact mile marker where it happened. The officer who took my report said they'd had a few reports of suspicious activity in that area over the past few months, but nothing as specific as what I'd described. 2 weeks later, I was checking the local news online and found a small article about a man whose car had been found abandoned on that same stretch of road. His family had reported him missing after he didn't show up to work, and search teams had found his vehicle with flat tires, 4 flat tires, sitting right where I'd seen those construction drums. There was no sign of the man himself. The article mentioned that his car appeared to have run over some kind of road debris that caused the tire damage. Road debris. That's what they were calling the spike strip. The man was still missing, and the article ended with a request for anyone with information to contact the local sheriff's department. I stared at that article for probably 10 minutes, thinking about how easily that could have been me. If I'd been a little more tired, a little less suspicious, a little more willing to get out and help what seemed like a woman in distress, I might have ended up as just another missing person report. I called the sheriff's department and spoke to a detective about my experience on that road. He was much more interested in my story than the 911 dispatcher had been. He said they were investigating several disappearances in the area and asked if I'd be willing to work with a sketch artist to describe the man I'd seen with the crowbar. I said yes, of course. It was the least I could do. The sketch session was harder than I expected. Even though I'd only seen the guy for a few seconds in my headlights, his face was burned into my memory. The artist was patient with me as I tried to describe the shape of his jaw, the way his hood cast shadows over his eyes, that cold expression that still gives me chills when I think about it. When we finished, she showed me the drawing, and it was like looking at a photograph. That face staring back at me from the paper made everything feel real again, in a way that was almost overwhelming. The detective told me they'd be sharing the sketch with other law enforcement agencies in the region and that I might hear from them again if there were any developments. That was 3 months ago, and I haven't heard anything since. I've avoided that route completely when I have to drive through Kentucky now, even though it adds almost 2 hours to the trip. I've told a few people about what happened, but most of them look at me like I'm exaggerating or making it up. My brother said I probably just saw some homeless people and let my imagination run wild because I was tired. But I know what I saw. I know how organized they were, how deliberately everything was set up. The spike strip alone would have cost them money. That's not something homeless people would have access to. These were people who had done this before, and probably kept doing it after I got away. I still think about that missing man sometimes, wondering what happened to him after his car hit that spike strip. Did he get out to check his tires and that's when they grabbed him? Did he try to fight back? Did he even realize what was happening before it was too late? The worst part is knowing that if I hadn't been driving that particular truck, if I hadn't noticed there was enough room on the shoulder to get around their trap, I would have ended up just like him. Sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, I think about how many other people might have driven down that road over the years and never been seen again. How many missing person cases that were never solved because nobody knew to look for an organized group of people setting traps on remote highways. It's changed how I think about traveling, especially alone. I always tell someone exactly what route I'm taking now, and I never take shortcuts through areas I don't know. I've learned to trust my instincts more too. If something feels wrong, it probably is. I'm just grateful that my paranoia and that old truck saved my life that night, and I hope that sketch helps catch those bastards before they hurt anyone else.